Yesterday, Congress pushed back on the suggestion that NASA skip the moon and go straight to sending humans to Mars. This had been suggested most recently by Elon Musk, although he didn't actually quite mean it that way. I have a video on that if you'd like to check it out. However, we all know that Elon Musk wants to send humans to Mars. That has been the reason why he started SpaceX and has been working so hard on developing human spaceflight. And now that Elon Musk has a lot of influence in the Trump administration, some have suggested that the new Trump administration will skip the moon and go straight to Mars, despite the fact that Artemis started under the first Trump administration. But as these things go, the president is not entirely in control of what NASA does. NASA gets its money from Congress. Congress appropriates and approves the budget. And so what the president says only has so much influence. It is Congress who needs to give the money for something to happen. We actually saw this back in the Obama administration when President Obama said that we are going to cancel the Constellation program that was a Moon to Mars program and we are going to go straight to Mars. But Congress did not fund it. And that is how we ended up where we are today. Yesterday, there was a House of Representatives hearing by the Space and Aeronautics Subcommittee titled Step by Step, the Artemis program and NASA's path to human exploration of the moon, Mars, and beyond. And there were really two main themes here. It was going to the moon first and China. China. Just about every representative plus the two witnesses mentioned China. Because it's not really common discourse when you're talking to the public about human exploration, but within political circles, there is a huge geopolitical competition, a great power competition between the United States and China. And one of the major topics that comes up when we're talking about Artemis and NASA's budget has been NASA needs to get back to the moon before China gets to the moon. And that has to do with geopolitical leadership. It has to do with capabilities. It has to do with setting the norms of behavior. And there's all these other reasons why you can list them. And not only is this a talking point within the United States, it's also a talking point within China, where they are saying essentially the same thing, just reversed. The hearing was led by my new representative, Mike Herodopoulos. I'm a new resident of the Space Coast. It was his first hearing on the subject. And it's always hard to tell whether someone's just repeating what the Artemis program is versus advocating for it, but he did mention that the Artemis program is a Moon to Mars program.
We are in a race to the moon, and America must win that race. Our journey to the moon is in service to a greater goal, one that President Trump outlined in his inaugural address, to plant the stars and stripes on the planet Mars. Since 2005, Congress has backed a step-by-step path to human exploration with Mars as the ultimate goal. A mission to Mars will be the defining moment of our era. It will be longer and even more difficult than a lunar landing, which is why we must prepare ourselves for the journey. The moon is our critical stepping stone, a proving ground to test technologies, refine operations, and reduce risks for future Mars missions. Every step we take towards the moon is a giant leap towards Mars.
And it seemed to me that he supported that architecture of moon first and then Mars. Representative Brian Babin, he got a bit more detailed. He's been in these hearings for many years. And he mentioned that throughout the years, even though the program has changed, Congress has always supported an incremental approach to sending astronauts to Mars, developing the technology and the operations and the capabilities of sending astronauts to the moon and then going on to Mars.
American astronauts have accomplished great feats in space. They have built space stations, operated the space shuttle, and of course walked on the moon. However, these programs are significant undertakings both in time and in resources. In 2005, Congress directed NASA to develop a sustained human presence on the moon as a stepping stone to future exploration of Mars and other destinations. The name and format of the program NASA would use to accomplish this goal changed with time. But in each of the authorization acts that followed over the years, Congress consistently directed NASA to pursue an incremental approach, using intermediate destinations to develop extensible technologies that would enable humans to explore the moon, Mars, and beyond. Space exploration is not a task for the faint of heart. American astronauts have accomplished great feats in space. They have built space stations, operated the space shuttle, and of course walked on the moon. However, these programs are significant undertakings both in time and in resources. In 2005, Congress directed NASA to develop a sustained human presence on the moon as a stepping stone to future exploration of Mars and other destinations. The name and format of the program NASA would use to accomplish this goal changed with time. But in each of the authorization acts that followed over the years, Congress consistently directed NASA to pursue an incremental approach, using intermediate destinations to develop extensible technologies that would enable humans to explore the moon, Mars, and beyond. Our nation is uniquely suited to provide leadership on the moon with our commercial and international partners. And additionally, the United States will maintain openness and transparency in its operations on the lunar surface.
In written testimony, the Coalition of Space Exploration, which is a group that is, I think, 40 or so companies in the space industry, and they tend to lean more traditional. They tend to have more of the big prime contractors. They put out a written testimony. I will have links to the hearing and the written testimony down below, by the way. They write, "The moon is not a detour on the path to the human exploration of deep space. It is the essential next step in expanding humanity's reach into the solar system." Representative Zoe Lofgren had stronger language. She said it was bad policy to skip the moon and go straight to Mars. And she asked the two witnesses what they thought. Now, the two witnesses are veterans of space policy, really good background, really good knowledge base. It was Scott Pace and Dan Dumbacher.
And even though SpaceX has contracts worth billions for developing human landing systems for the return of our astronauts to the moon, Mr. Musk keeps talking about heading straight to Mars. Beyond the obvious fact that this approach could serve his personal interests, I think it's bad policy. And I'd like to ask both of you, Mr. Dumbacher and Dr. Pace, you're both experts. So please, in your opinions, why are we going to the moon while keeping our sights on Mars? And what would it mean to abruptly change the long-standing moon to Mars approach?
Scott Pace brought up something that not many people talk about anymore. Back during the first Trump administration, when Artemis was really solidified as the program of record that we see today, there was an outpouring of international support from our allies and international partners. The moon is seen as accessible. And when we here in the United States say, why would we go back to the moon? We've been there, we've done that. The global community has not been there and done that. It's really just been for a few years, a few people, many years ago, 50-some years ago, that we sent humans to the moon. And so for these international partners, for a program to come on board that they can be part of, that they can contribute a small part of, they really wanted to be on board with that. They could convince their governments to fund a small part of participating in a global mission to the moon better than they could to Mars.
Leadership in space today is different than Apollo. Apollo is about look what we can do by ourselves. Today it's about look what we do that gets other people that want to be with us. I would also submit that the idea of going directly to Mars actually was already tried. It was tried during the Obama administration when they abandoned the moon and said, well, let's go to Mars. Of course, I was very critical of this, not because I was critical of Mars, but because I was critical of a program that I thought was disconnected from geopolitical reality. Other countries really couldn't cooperate with us. And so when SPD-1 was after it was signed, I had the opportunity to be in Tokyo at a major space meeting, and the tenor of the room was completely different. People were like, oh, we can do the moon. What do you need? How can we help? What can be part of it? Yes, they're with us on the idea of Mars as the goal and build forward to that. But to do that separate from where other people are, I think left the U.S. in a worse geopolitical position. Not intentional, but it left us in a worse position as a result. So I think while people can have their personal interests in how to go about space exploration, I think the national interest is one which really enhances the position of the United States, and the sequential steps that the Congress has laid out are, in fact, in those national interests.
So we need to put our national interest ahead of our personal interest.
I remember that energy because it affected me as well. I've always been a lunatic, and I've always really wanted to personally go to the moon. So when the Obama administration was focused on Mars, it was a bit taboo to talk about the moon. There was really not much activity, even with uncrewed landers or rover, even with uncrewed activities to go to the moon. But always in the back of my mind, I'm like, I really hope that someday we can do more activities, more spacecraft to the moon, and eventually people again. And I remember the excitement that I felt during the first Trump administration when Artemis program came into being, that I too was caught up in that excitement that not only is NASA going to go back, but we're going to bring lots of people together with us. So then the question is, what are the next steps? Artemis 2 is scheduled for next year, and I surprisingly, I am completely in line with Scott Pace. Pretty much everything Scott Pace said in this hearing, I was totally on board with, totally agreeing with. And I've been saying that I think it's a good idea to continue to do Artemis 2 and 3 as they are currently proposed, the current architecture, and then change it up after Artemis 4. Maybe keep Artemis 4 the way it is, but probably not, because it has that upgraded SLS and that upgraded tower that's just so expensive, it's taking so long. I want Blue Moon to fly. Blue Moon is scheduled for Artemis 4. I want Blue Moon to fly in a future Artemis program. But Artemis 3, I think, is where we need to cut it off. And the reason for that is it's just not sustainable. We've been saying this for how many years? SLS and Orion are too slow and they're too expensive. It's not a sustainable program. However, they're currently built when it comes to Artemis 2. Artemis 2 is pretty much set. It's not really, because there's still another year until it launches, but it's got so much already there. Artemis 3, in a similar way, is already on the path. It's not totally set. They can switch it up, but it's well down the path. And therefore, I agree with Pam Melroy when she's arguing we should do Artemis 2 and Artemis 3 the way that they are now, and then consider actually canceling SLS and Orion and switching to commercial options. This is what Scott Pace had to say.
The concern is the Space Launch System, which is expensive and not reusable. It's had one flight, but has trouble meeting the congressional target of 2 cores per year. It's time to consider alternatives from going to the Earth, to the Moon, and back. Ideally, NASA should be able to buy heavy lift services to send payloads to the Moon. Where I was particularly pointing at is the need for more sustainable, more reusable systems for going from the Earth to the Moon, which is why I talk about having an on-ramp, if you will, for alternative heavy lift options. The Artemis II and III cores are already under construction, being built. I wouldn't propose really changing that. I think trying to change that and do something else would produce more delays and would push us past 2030. But as I look beyond that, the next Artemis II and III missions, maybe 4, we should be thinking about other alternatives we can have to have that sustainable presence.
This caught people by surprise because in the past, Scott Pace has approved of SLS and Orion. However, when the Artemis program was first proposed, it didn't have all the options that it has today. It has not just Starship, which is in development. It also has ULA's Vulcan. It has Blue Origin's New Glenn. And in the past, we have had United Launch Alliance with some heavier vehicles there, Delta IV, etc. But there's more options now. There's more capability now. So there's more incentive to take on a commercial vehicle or multiple commercial vehicles to accomplish the same goal at a faster pace and a lower cost. There are some skeptics, Dan Dumbacher and Representative Loughran in particular.
From my experience, I have learned it's about doing the right thing at the right time. Therefore, the discussion is not Moon or Mars. Rather, timing dictates that we must first master the Moon and then proceed to Mars. NASA's current plan to return people to the Moon requires approximately 35 to 40 Starship launches to first demonstrate the capability on an uncrewed mission and then execute the first human mission planned for Artemis III. I ask this: can 40 launches, development and demonstration of the undeveloped and undemonstrated on-orbit rocket fuel station, and integration of a complex operational scenario across multiple systems all successfully occur by 2030? The probability of success for this plan is remote at best.
I can definitely see where they're coming from. I too am a little bit worried about Starship, honestly. A little bit worried about Starship's progress, not about the whole program, but about the progress, the speed. And I think we're going to see with this upcoming test flight that's happening, currently scheduled for Monday, test flight 8, whether or not Starship is going well. It's made some fantastic milestones. I've been super impressed, but it is going slower than I hoped. We still need to see it get safely to orbit. We still need to see it do refueling. We still need to see a prototype uncrewed lander on the surface of the Moon. We still need to see people on board, and then NASA will be ready to fly its astronauts on Artemis III. So there's a lot of milestones. I need to see the refueling happen, and I agree that there's a lot of refueling that needs to be done. I want to see it all happen. I want to see the SpaceX magic happen, where it all comes together. But is it going to happen in time? And what is in time? Is it going to happen before China lands people on the moon is what they are focused on. I'm not so focused on that. I just want to know, is it going to happen before people run out of patience? Here is what Dan Dumbacher suggests.
For one, I take advantage of the hardware I already have in the barn, and the hardware available in Artemis II and III to go make it happen. Number two is I get myself a simplified lander so that I can get to the moon that does not require multiple launches. My 40 number comes from demonstrating it twice. I have to do the whole mission twice, once uncrewed and then crewed. Right. I need to get that number of launches dramatically reduced. I need to go simple. So use the hardware I have available. I have to go get a small new lander to go do that.
Now, interestingly, he doesn't really elaborate on what this new lander, small lander, simplified lander is. In his written testimony, he doesn't mention it at all. It kind of reminds me of this graphic from Blue Origin where they were making fun of or advocating against Starship HLS because it requires so much refueling, and I don't know if that number is accurate anymore. This is a graphic from 2021. I got a kick out of it. I think someone made a t-shirt out of it. So it reminds me a bit of that, where we're still a little concerned about how much goes into Starship HLS's operations when it comes to Artemis III. But what alternative is there? There is no current alternative. I mean, maybe SpaceX can modify Starship HLS and make it a little bit simpler and then increase the size or complexity or whatever. But there is no other alternative right now. We've got Blue Moon. The Blue Moon is also still in development. It's not ready yet. There's no other human landing system for the surface of the moon. It reminds me a bit of the Constellation program, where Altair was the internal NASA human landing system for the lunar surface, and it was canceled. I mean, Constellation was canceled, but that part in particular was criticized as being way too expensive and not sustainable. There was not going to be a budget for it because it was just ballooning in cost. And that's what this reminds me of a little bit, is that what alternative do we have? And NASA can't build it internally. It's going to cost way too much and take way too long. So we don't have anybody else. What we do have is one company, only one, that has successfully proven itself to fly NASA astronauts repeatedly over and over since 2020, and that's SpaceX. I am on the side of trusting the company that has repeatedly flown astronauts safely to Earth orbit, that they can eventually accomplish the objective of sending astronauts to the moon. Representative Keith Self, he asked this question.
George W. Bush in 2004 said we would go to the moon by 2020. Well, immediately after that, we had President Obama, who canceled programs, who, I think you mentioned Mars. I think there was an asteroid in there. Real simple question. How many years did the Obama destruction of this program cost us?
Woo, what a loaded question. And I can see where he's coming from. I honestly do. Like I said, during the Obama administration, there was a bit of a taboo talking about the moon. A lot of lunar activities from the Constellation program, they were simply ramped down. There was loss of institutional knowledge. The people retired. People moved on to other things. And then there was that ramp back up during the beginning stages of the Artemis program. So there was a delay, no doubt about it. But Constellation was never going to happen. If you want to know why Mike Griffin is wrong that we need to bring back Constellation, watch this video that I did about how completely unfeasible it is to bring back Constellation. So that was not going to get us anywhere. So how long, I don't know how these witnesses actually answered that question. I agree that there was a delay. I don't know how to answer that question other than Constellation wasn't going to do it for us. We would have had to change Constellation anyway. Because the key here is sustainable. We don't just want this flags and footprints. We've been talking about this for how many years now? We don't want Apollo 2. We want something that is sustainable over time, and which is what Scott Pace is saying, and what even Dan Dumbacher is saying, that use what we have now to get there quickly and then change things up and make it more sustainable. By the way, whoever put the phrase decision velocity in the vocabulary of NASA leaders, I'm hearing this all over the place. Decision velocity, moving quickly to make decisions, and I agree that needs to happen. Well, an interesting thing was that NASA chose not to provide a witness for this hearing. They were invited to, they did not provide a witness, and it makes me wonder if NASA is simply waiting from either directive from on high, from the Trump administration or from Elon Musk, conflict of interest there, or they're waiting for Jared Isaacman, who is the nominated next NASA administrator, to be approved by the Senate. So NASA might not want to go on record right now to discuss the Artemis program when everything might be changing pretty quickly. Meanwhile, we do have some really cool NASA lunar missions going on right now. There are 3 lunar landers heading to the surface of the moon right now, 2 of them from the Commercial Lunar Payload Services Program CLPS. I'm going to be doing some videos on those, but if you want to know a bit more about the CLPS program and why I'm personally excited about it and whether it's worth it, whether they're going to succeed or fail, check this video out next. And I'm wishing those missions the best of luck because I am cheering them on.